This is Research Like a Pro, episode 141, Writing Compelling Family History Stories. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hey, Nicole, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about you? What have you been working on?
I've just been getting started on a client project, working on study group projects, and I've been reading a really interesting new book, and we've got the author Annette Gendler here to talk with us about that today, and it's called How to Write Compelling Stories from Family History. We love writing, and as well as writing research reports and commenting on the records, we also love to write stories about our ancestors. So I'm so excited to talk to Annette. Hi, Annette.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. So let me just give a little bit of an intro. I'm just going to read the little snippet on the back of Annette's book to introduce her to everyone, and then we'll let her talk a little bit about what she does. Annette is the author of Jumping Over Shadows, the memoir of a German Jewish love that overcame the legacy of the Holocaust. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Tablet Magazine, Bella Grace, and Geveller, among others. She lives with her husband and 3 children in Chicago. I just wanted to ask you what inspired this book. This book came out in 2019, How to Write Compelling Stories from Family History. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what you do and your inspiration for writing the book.
Sure. I've been teaching memoir writing at StoryStudio Chicago since 2006, which has been a long time. And I want to say the last 10 plus years, I've been teaching their advanced memoir workshop, which I sort of created. And we just meet once a week. And it's a group of people that keeps changing, but we have some people who've been with me for a long time. And it's all people who are very dedicated to writing memoir. Now, memoir doesn't necessarily have to be about family history, but I have found that is what I am most interested in myself. Before I even started teaching, I was working on my MFA, and my MFA thesis project was a collection of essays on my father's family from what is now the Czech Republic. And that really stemmed from a visit to their hometown in 2002. I'd never been there before, and I just felt so many undercurrents in that place. I felt so connected, and I knew sort of the milestones of the family history, but I never really, I could not have retold it. Let's put it that way. Like I didn't know all the details and how people had felt about it. So thankfully, my grandfather was a writer. He was a poet, and he wrote audio dramas for what was then the German radio station in Prague. So he was a really good writer, and thankfully, he sat down in the late 50s to write his memoirs. And there's a chapter in there called My Sister, and that really retells the story of his sister who married a Jewish man before World War II, and that plunged the family into all kinds of complications once the Nazis took over their hometown. And then when I ended up marrying a Jewish man in Germany, and I converted, and so history repeated itself. I was very aware of that. We got married in the late 80s, but I had never really put all the pieces together in a diligent way. And so after that trip, I asked my sister to dig out my grandfather's memoirs, and I actually sat down and read them. It's not a book-length manuscript, and the chapter about his sister that detailed what I was looking at was, maybe 15 pages. It was very dense, but very informative. And so for my master's thesis, I sort of extrapolated and wrote about different aspects of that interested me and that I know impacted my life. And so I was sort of launched on that process of making something of my own family history. And so the product of that, based on my master's project, became Jumping Over Shadows because one of my master's advisors said, well, the story of the past is all fine and good, but nobody's really going to care about that unless you show how it matters in the present. So I said to him, what do you mean I have to write my own story? And he said, yep, you got it. So that's what Jumping Over Shadows. Based on that experience of writing my memoir based on a large part of family history and looking at how that resonated in my own life and how the family history influenced my own decisions, I started putting together a workshop after Jumping Over Shadows came out 4 years ago, helping people do exactly what I had done, how to convert family history into a compelling story. And because I've been teaching for a long time, I ended up giving this workshop in all kinds of writing festivals and different conferences in different places around the world. And I got the question one too many times, do you have any materials based on this? I can't attend your workshop, but do you have any notes to share? And so I got that question one too many times, and I thought to myself, there's a book there. I should put that together. So that's what in the end became How to Write Compelling Stories from Family History. It was more of a challenge than you would think it was because my workshops are organic. They're very interactive, and I certainly have a syllabus, but to translate the very interactive conversations and discussions I have with my students into a book, books are very linear. Books just exist on the page. That was actually a greater challenge than I thought it would be. But that's the story of how this little book came about.
I think that happens so often that we start with our own experiences and we start teaching others, and then we decide to get it out there so the public can use it. And I have been reading your book, and I love how it's got so much detail in it, but yet it's simple and it's accessible. And I really love how you have prompts through it to get you thinking. So I commend you on a job well done. It's really exciting to have another resource to use when writing our own family stories.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit more about this idea of writing stories based on our family history while applying it to ourselves now to make it more meaningful in the present. So tell us more about why you think that idea is important.
Family history really shapes who we are, right? And it's not just what happened in the past, it's also how it impacted the people who raised us. It could be something that happened to your great grandparents. Let's say they made the decision to emigrate from Poland to the United States. Well, that's a momentous shift in the family history. You are a different person than you would have been had your family stayed there, and your experiences would have been very different. So I think that understanding family history helps us understand who we are. So in the example of my family, my grandparents and my father was 13 at the time, were expelled from Czechoslovakia, from their homeland where their family had lived for a very, very long time, after World War II, when all people of German heritage, whether they had been Nazi supporters or not, were expelled from the Eastern territories. So from Czechoslovakia, from Poland, from parts of Russia, from parts of Romania. And so that changed the whole trajectory of our family. My family suddenly they became refugees in what would then be the Federal Republic of Germany. And so I ended up being in a generation that didn't have that rootedness that my grandparents had. And my father ended up shipping off to the United States to get a PhD, met my mom, married an American. So the generation of myself and my siblings, we grew up with 2 passports, 2 languages. So we were everything but rooted. And so I think that understanding what happened in the past and how the people that raised us were shaped by it and decisions that they made really, really makes us who we are. And so I think family history is a great tool in helping us understand who we are, which is, I think, something that any halfway introspective person spends their lifetime doing. And then the other thing is that I do think that family history also helps us live our lives. So as an example, I seem to have inherited my grandmother's hips, all right, which means I have a nice figure. It also means as I aged, my hips started deteriorating. I didn't really realize that whole connection until I started having hip problems, and one of the surgeons, but he asked me, is there any family history of hip problems? And first I said no, because my parents don't have it. And then I remember, wait a minute, grandma had 2 hip replacements in her 70s. Oh boy, and then I thought about it and I'm like, I'm shaped like her. I don't have my mother's figure. I have hers. So that's one thing, to know where that physical history comes from. But what I was more interested in, how did she manage with that? And I wish I could ask her now and be like, when did you make the decisions to do those hip replacements? How did you deal with the pain? That was my main interest. So I think that just so many examples of what we inherited has a big impact on our lives, and the people that came before us could really help us. And I think the current pandemic is another great example, where we sort of turn to our forebears and look at how did they manage through the Spanish flu. And we wish, someone in 1920 had kept a journal of what everyday life was like. And maybe that would have given us some insight on how to deal with the current upheaval.
Yes, I loved your discussion of the hip problems. And I think knowing the traits we inherit from our forebears is very fascinating and does bring up curiosity about how they dealt with it. So that's a really compelling reason to learn more about our family history, especially while our parents and grandparents are here and we can talk to them and ask them questions.
Right. And unfortunately, a lot of the things, my grandmother lived a very long life for her generation. She died when I was 29. But unfortunately, a lot of things happen much later. I'm pushing 60 now. And so my grandmother is not going to be around anymore. And I can't ask her. So that's, I think, why it is so wonderful if someone took the time to write a diary, to write letters that we can turn back to and look at and be like, how did they deal with this problem that I'm facing now? Maybe they wrote something about that.
I love that idea that we can turn to their diaries and letters, because we know our parents or our grandparents generally through the eyes of a child or, a younger adult. And as we age and we come across similar situations to what they experienced, maybe we can gain some strength or understanding through those resources.
Right.
So that's a great perspective. Well, a lot of our listeners are researchers. I would say probably all of our listeners are researchers. And I think a big question is how to turn our research, all this work that we're gathering on facts and dates and what happened to our ancestors, how to actually turn that into a story. So, what do you think is the greatest challenge in doing that?
I have found that the greatest challenge, even if you're not a researcher, is to understand what a story is and what makes an interesting story. So, in literary terms, it's the easiest to think about story if you think about how a movie is structured, or when you go to the theater. So, a story takes place in a specific time. So I'm giving you now the sort of the run through of all the things that you need to have in place in order to tell a story. So you need a specific time, date, year, season. You need a specific place. So when you think about it, you're going to the theater, you see the stage, right? And everything that happens in that story takes place on that stage. You might have slightly different settings, you might move, but still, you have a certain place and time. You need characters, so people that are interacting, that become more than just puppets, that where we get a little bit more insight into how they think, what their emotions are, what their challenges are. And then you need an inciting incident. Why are you telling the stories? What's the crucial thing that happened that you feel you need to share this? And then, as I mentioned, you need some action, so that usually it's the characters interacting, and even if it's just them talking to each other. And then, most importantly, when you have all those pieces in place, there needs to be some kind of transformation, some kind of change, right? And that can be a small realization. So, not all stories have to be big drama. It can just be a small realization that you had and that you sort of put into a story. So, those are the components that make a story. And so, as a writer, the challenge is to learn how to sift through all the research material that you have and then look at, oh, I know this happened to my, let's say, my grandfather, and I really want to tell about it. And then you have to start filling in, okay, I know this happened. I know it was important. I happen to know what he thought maybe because it's based on a letter that he wrote. But if you use a letter, for instance, letters tend to be pretty one-dimensional, right? In the sense that one person is writing to another person, and the other person usually knows a lot of the context, right? They know where the letter writer lives, they know that person's circumstances. So those are the kinds of things that when you tell the story for an audience that doesn't know the letter writer you're basing your story on, then you need to fill in all that context. What time were they living in, what place, what kind of person were they? And that doesn't need to be all in description because that can get pretty boring. And I think that's another challenge, that when we often write, we sort of set the scene up front, right? And so we spend 1 or 2 paragraphs describing where it takes place and describing the time it takes place before getting into the action. And so quite often you will lose readers because those descriptive paragraphs are boring, because why would you care? So it's better to start with the action and get the reader interested in what's happening, and then filling in the backstory as the story goes along with just very minute brush strokes is usually what works. So there's a certain art, obviously, and that's what my book really tries to help people with, understand how to take the material that you have, figure out which stories are worthwhile telling, and then learning the different tools and employing the different tools to actually create a story that then people will want to keep telling.
So, in your experience, as you have worked with so many people, I'm just guessing it's probably hundreds, if not thousands of people in writing their family history, what do you think makes the most interesting material for grabbing that reader's interest and keeping them interested?
So that goes back to my thesis advisor's advice, which was look at where the past has an impact on the present. So as a very simple example, you serve the same fruit cake every Christmas. Okay, that's great aunt Molly's recipe. So here you have a connection between the past, great aunt Molly, and the fruitcake recipe that you still serve. So there's that connection in people, because everybody likes a fruitcake, or maybe they don't like it, but there's a connection there to the past. And so that's an opening to write a story about great aunt Molly. Who was this person? What do we know about her? Give us the background story, let's see, of that fruitcake. And there you have a story from the past that we would be interested in, because what she did still has an impact on who we are and what we're doing, because we're still baking that fruitcake every year. And so I think that, to me, is sort of the sifting device that I recommend to people, is to look at what are you still doing, or where are you living? Maybe it's a house you inherited that you're still living in that belonged to your grandparents, something like that, a connection between the past and the present. Those are the most interesting stories, and those are the stories that are really the most worthwhile telling.
I love that, what you said about look for the connections from the past to the present. I think sometimes we don't realize we have those connections, like the story with the fruitcake. And so we may have to really look around and be thinking of what we are doing in the present that comes from the past. So that's a great idea. And I also liked what you said at the beginning about your family coming from Europe to the United States and how that was a major impact. Sometimes they're so obvious, like that's an obvious huge change for your family, but then some of us, our ancestors have been here for a couple hundred years, and we don't really have that immigrant story. So we've got to look at something else in our past to find the transformative stories for our own family history. So really interesting to think about what we can find to write about in our family history.
Right. I mean, I can give you a very mundane example, and I'd be happy to share the link. So most of the family history I've written was my father's family from the Czech Republic. But 12 years ago, we bought property in Northwest Indiana. And one of the first things we bought was a tractor, because we realized you can't really have a big piece of land without a tractor. And so we got this tractor. And as we're sort of, learning how to use this thing, my husband says to me, we have that tractor because of your grandfather. And I looked at him like, what do you mean? And he said, well, you used to work on a tractor with your grandfather. So for you, it was completely natural that we needed to buy a tractor. And then I realized it's totally true. I mean, I only really spent one vacation because I grew up in Germany and my mom's parents lived in Michigan. But I really only spent one long Easter vacation, 3 weeks on my grandparents' farm. Is a bit of a misnomer because they really didn't farm, but it was a big country property and they were building an A-frame house and they had a tractor. And so my grandfather was out all the time working on this tractor and he took me along. And so I have memories of pulling stumps out of the wood with that tractor and feeling awesome sitting on the stoop there on the wheel. So there was a connection of my American grandfather, who sadly died 2 years after that visit, whom I didn't have that much interaction with. But here was a connection to what I was doing in my life and how it sort of was very natural for me to, yeah, you have country property, you get a tractor, and then you work in the woods and you pull stuff out of the woods and you work with the trees, etc. So I wrote that story so that it can be very everyday life type of things where you can see that past has an influence on you.
That gives us all hope that we can all find something to write about.
For sure. Once you start looking, you'll find way more than you ever thought there was.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So, what tips do you have for people who maybe don't know where to start with writing their family history?
So I think the most important thing is because it can be quite overwhelming, particularly when you've done a lot of research, you have so much material and you just don't know where to begin. So I start small, take something, and objects are great for that. So, if you have a vase that you inherited from your grandmother, write the story about your vase. I have a student who I posed the prompt, write about a family heirloom, and he wrote about a tea cart that his mother had inherited from her adoptive mother, and it ended up being this whole family genealogy story almost, just based around that tea cart. So that also gives you some focus, and you can package a lot of family connections around that one object that keeps it interesting and focused and short. The other thing is that something is better than nothing. So write something, don't feel like you have to write a polished story, going back to the diaries and the letters in our day and age, we don't write letters anymore. There's very little physical evidence of our lives unless we take the trouble to, for instance, save and print out a long WhatsApp exchange or print out a series of emails or something like that. So I think that in our very digital age, it's important to, if you don't print stuff out, put it in a collection that's accessible to people. So to take some time and organize those materials, and anything you do that'll make the family history or your life and your experiences more accessible to the next generation, I think is really, really useful.
What a good idea to just start small and to just do something to make that family history accessible.
Yeah, I mean, my grandmother didn't really write much, for instance. She was a great storyteller. So there was a lot that I had to rely on my own memory of what she had told me, but she only wrote handwritten, which is another challenge because you have to be able to read it. But she had written about 20 pages of her childhood. A lot of it was uninteresting to me, but on a subsequent visit to the Czech Republic, my sister and I went to visit the family mill, which is now abandoned and a ruin. But in those 20 pages or so that she had written about what summers had been like at that mill. And that gave us information about the area. And she talked about a hill that she would always run to that had like 100 steps leading up to a chapel, and that's still there. So that was a beautiful way of allowing us, my sister and me in this case, to connect to her childhood and how she had perceived this landscape. The landscape's still there, so we can sort of step into the past almost. So anything that you can do to capture what you went through, even if it's just a photo album, will be really, really valuable to someone in the future. I can guarantee that.
I think a lot of our listeners can really relate to letters. I know I just brought home a few boxes from my mother's estate, and what do we do with the letters? To me, that is sort of an overwhelming thing. Letters and the journals and diaries. there can be so much information in there. So any ideas for us?
Yeah, I agree. Letters are a treasure trove, but also a huge challenge. So the first thing I would recommend is to sit down and retype those letters. And that serves a couple of purposes. First of all, if you retype someone else's writing, you get into their head because you're mimicking their voice, and the way they wrote, you're writing the way they wrote. And I think that helps you a lot to understand what their emotions were, because you sort of put yourself into the shoes of actually producing that text rather than reading it as a recipient. So I think that helps a lot if you wanted to write about the life of the letter writer. Secondly, obviously, you're also providing a service to whoever else might want to read those letters, because handwriting, even though it's wonderful to preserve it and there's so much character in a handwritten letter, it's still a huge challenge because the next generation has to be able to read it. So yesterday, I helped someone decipher a postcard that their great grandfather had received from Vienna. It was mailed in Vienna in 1908. First of all, it's written in German. Secondly, it's written in the old German hand script, which I can decipher, but it's a challenge for me. And so as time goes by, those things are harder. You'll need an expert to read something like that. So if you retype it in our print, at least that we all can read, it'll be more useful to the next generation. And then I think the next step, if you wanted to do something with that letter, is to start filling out and creating the letter writer and the recipient as characters and figuring out, what's the interaction? Why are they writing the letters? What is the content of the letter? And that'll give you something to work with. The most pivotal chapter of Jumping Over Shadows is based on a letter that my grandfather wrote about the actual deportation experience. In his memoirs, he never wrote about the most pivotal experience in the family's life. He didn't write about that. And so subsequently, I found this letter that he had thankfully typed and sent to what I think were, just a circle of friends, because it was an onion skin copy that I have. It gave me the blow by blow of what had happened, but it didn't give me the broader historical context. There were people mentioned, obviously, that I didn't know. So that's where your research skills come in, because then you have to start filling out the context to actually create that story. And I can send you guys the link because it came out as a short story as well. It's called The Flying Dutchman, the chapter that I created, the story that I created from that letter. And there, I did archival research, or like looking up the weather report, because I knew exactly the date of when that deportation happened. And nowadays, it's very easy to look up what the weather was like on that particular day. And so you can provide that physical and more sensual context to create the story that then will be engaging for a reader.
I really love that you talk about discovering the connection between the letter writer and the letter recipient. That is something I had not really considered, their relationship and why the letter's being written. That is a really interesting facet of thinking about figuring out a story from a letter. Love that.
Yeah.
Annette, what should we do if we have a situation where we just don't know very much about an ancestor? There isn't that much information. Do you have any kind of tips for how to go about that?
Yeah, so people come across that a lot, including me. And there's often an ancestor who you're really intrigued by, but you just have very sparse information. So in that case, if you really want to write about that person, I would make the quest the story. I would make the discovery and your own research, your quest into figuring out what you can figure out, and also sharing why you're interested in that person, because that gives the story energy. People always say that, why am I bothering? Why am I reading this? So if you share that with your reader, then they will care. So if you share why you're interested in that person, what that person means to you, what you know about that person, what research you did, where you ran into brick walls, where there's contradictory information, that also often happens, that there's a certain legend passed down in the family, and then, you do some research, and then you find that there's no hard evidence at all for that legend. And in fact, the hard evidence contradicts the legend. And then you can kind of interrogate that finding and ask yourself, why did the family perpetuate that legend? Where did it come from? You can write a story based on your own speculations. You can interrogate the material. So you don't necessarily, that's the beauty of stories. It doesn't necessarily have to be based on hard fact. Now, obviously, if you're writing memoir, you should disclose that with tags like I'm wondering, or I imagine, or I ask myself, if you want to stay to the facts of what you know. The other way to go about this is to write historical fiction. I think a lot of historical fiction comes from this very conundrum that you find an interesting story in your own family's past or someone else's past that you just find so compelling and intriguing, but the material is too sparse to write a proper biography or a proper memoir. And so you write historical fiction, and that'll be a story based on a true story.
What a great idea. I have a family legend that I really wanted to find out if it was accurate or not, and ended up finding it wasn't accurate. And it really was fascinating to tell the story. We all have things like that in our past where we wonder if it's
Right.
true. But yeah, that's such a good idea to talk about our experience with discovering.
Yeah, because that's another sort of connector between you and the reader, because so many of us have the same problems. There's a great universality in all the frustrations and all the joys that come with researching your family history. If you share that, you might give people ideas of research that you've done that they maybe didn't think about, but at the very least, like, oh, I'm not alone with this. This is a very typical experience. And so I think that that's another great way to share and connect with like-minded souls.
Those are such great ideas. Well, I know that there are probably a lot of people wondering about the family secrets, because inevitably, as we research the family, read the letters, the diaries, the journals, discover things in documents or newspapers, we're going to find some family secrets and things that maybe just were hushed up in the past and we don't talk about those. How do we deal with that?
When you stumble across a secret, or you stumble across the solution to a secret, let's put it that way, I think there are a couple of things to consider. First of all, you have to ask yourself, why was this kept a secret? And they're usually, at least in my family, they're usually very compelling reasons, often, due to the political situation. And so you have to think about whether it is safe to air that secret. But secondly, I think that in airing secrets, I think we have to sort of rein ourselves in a little bit, because it's obviously very exciting. And, if you find something like that, the first impetus is to, go around and share it. But I think it behooves us to question that a little bit and look at what our own motivations are to airing it. Is it just sort of the gossipy side that we all have? Is the relative still alive? And if they are, you really have to consider the ramifications of, spilling the beans on them. If you have a good relationship with them, you might want to talk to them about it, but maybe it's not your place. You might want to mention it to someone who's closer to them. Again, be careful, because I think that family secrets sometimes have their reason, and you have to sort of, recently, with all the DNA research that has, uncovered so many family connections people didn't know about, and that can really, really upset the whole equilibrium in a family. And so I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that you should be very circumspect about it. And the other thing goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Does it really help anyone? Is it just sort of sensationalism on the discoverer's part, or does it inform the family of something that would help them understand themselves better? That would release some tension, that would explain something that before was a huge puzzle to everyone. So those are the things that I would caution everyone to think about before you go about spilling the beans.
Those are two really good things to think about. I like the idea of thinking of what would be the importance of telling the secret, because a lot of times those things were a secret because of cultural ways of looking at things. But sometimes there are real emotional things that come down in the family that can cause a lot of issues or damage in families, and knowing past situations can help people to get a grasp on why that happened in their family and come to some understanding. So,
Right.
so good to step back and really consider why you'd want to talk about this and how it could be part of healing. We've seen a lot of healing when some of these things are discovered and give some understanding about why grandpa was like grandpa was, so good food for thought there.
Right. And I think it helps if it's done in a very considered way. It also helps us avoid the same mistakes. It helps the family get out of whatever roundabout they might have been traveling in.
I completely agree. That's so fascinating. Let's just kind of end up this really interesting podcast with one final question. So your book has got so many tips. I love that I have this and I can use this as reference. But aside from purchasing your book and reading it, which I hope our listeners will do, what tips do you have in kind of our final closing up moments here, whether you're a genealogist or consider yourself someone who'd want to write a memoir based on family history?
So my main recommendation would be to read memoirs that have done exactly what you're trying to do. Try to find memoirs that deal with the same time period, with the same country, with the same conundrum. In the back of the book, there's a list of for further reading, and those are just books that I have read that I thought were really, really masterfully done, really well done. Because I think that when you said about writing about family history, there's so many challenges that you come across because families are so complex. So you have different countries, you have different regions, you have different languages, there are various political upheavals. So, and then there are memoirs, for instance, I'll give you one example. So Sarah Wildman wrote a book called Paper Love, and it's about her grandfather's first love, whom the family never knew about, but this was a girl that he left behind in pre-World War II Vienna, and she was actually from the Czech Republic, so she ended up moving back there. And they were all Jewish, and she ended up disappearing in the Holocaust. So she's one of the people who just disappears basically, and we don't quite know what happened to her. So she undertook this, was really a huge research project into this person that nobody had known about, kind of in a way create a memory for her, but also to sort of pay homage, I think, to one of the 6 million who had perished. And so that book is a great example of how to undertake a project like that, for instance, based on a one-sided letter correspondence, because she only had the letters of this woman that she found in the attic. She didn't have her grandfather's letters back. So that's another challenge with letters, that quite often it's a one-sided correspondence that you're left with. And people can always contact me through my website. I have read a lot of books in that direction, and so I'm happy to try to give recommendations if people are looking for books to read. But I think it just helps to see how someone else did that, and it gives you a model of, I'm not saying you need to necessarily do it that way, but it gives you a model of not only how to go about that project, but also how to tell that kind of a story.
That is a fabulous tip. So glad you mentioned that.
Right. And it gives you ideas, it gives you other ideas that you might not even have thought about.
Exactly. You can read it and think, wow, I really like how they told that in the first person, or I didn't like that, so many different things that you could think of as you're reading it. So thank you. That is a great tip. Well, it has just been a pleasure, Annette, talking with you and learning from your experience. You have worked with so many people, and in doing your workshop and writing the book, I think you've got some great helps for anyone who's interested to get started with writing. And I just want to go back to one of the things you said right at the beginning, that we should just start small. We don't have to write the big 500-page book. We can just write a little story and give that to everybody in the family for a Christmas present, right? We can do something small to get started.
I think if you start small and you write one story, not only do you have an end product that you can share, it also teaches you how to go about this. And once you start, you'll start having other ideas. And then you kind of become empowered on this path. And next thing you know, you have 10, 12 stories, and they might coalesce around, an area or a person. And then you have a book.
Absolutely.
That's how you do that. That's how you do that.
That is right. That's so great. I just so appreciate you taking the time to talk with us, and I hope everyone listening picked up some tips. I don't know how you couldn't pick up some great tips from this interview. So thank you again, Annette, and I hope that all of our listeners will go and write something. So everyone have a great week, and thank you so much.
I hope so too. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our Research Like a Pro online course or join our next study group. Learn more at FamilyLocket.com. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our eCourse or study group. If you like what you heard and would like to support this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.